In the autumn of 1887, when Birmingham's foundries belched their amber smoke into skies already heavy with unspoken truths, there came to light a case that would test the very foundations upon which our medical establishment rested. The infant Henry Mallory possessed a peculiarity that defied both nature and explanation, two distinct voices emanating from a single throat, speaking words no child of 1 year should know. Dr. Percival Thorn, physician to the Crown's most delicate matters, arrived in Edgbaston with instruments that gleamed too brightly and papers bearing seals that commanded absolute silence. What followed was not healing, but burial, not of the child, but of truth itself. The records speak in whispers of procedures that should never have been, of a mother's anguish transformed into complicity, of voices silenced not by death, but by something far more deliberate. The first reports came not from the Mallory household itself, but from Mrs. Beatrice Whitmore, whose parlour window faced directly onto the narrow courtyard where Elizabeth Mallory hung her washing each Tuesday morning. Mrs. Whitmore, a woman whose ears had been trained by 40 years of monitoring neighbourhood propriety, noticed the voices sometime in late September, two distinct tones emanating from the infant Henry as he lay in his perambulator beneath the soot-stained elm. One voice possessed the expected gurgling quality of a child barely past his first year, but the second carried an unsettling clarity, forming words with a precision that made her teacup rattle against its saucer. She would later testify in hushed tones to the parish visitor that the clearer voice spoke of things no infant should comprehend, of darkness beneath floorboards, of secrets buried in consecrated ground, of names that belonged to the dead. Elizabeth Mallory herself had noticed the peculiarity weeks earlier, though she confided in no one save her diary, whose pages would later be seized by authorities bearing the Crown's seal. The young mother, widowed when her husband perished in a factory accident mere months after Henry's birth, had initially dismissed the dual voices as a trick of her grief-addled mind. Yet, as autumn deepened and the voices grew more distinct, she could no longer deny what her ears perceived. The child would lie in his cot, speaking in his natural infant babble, when suddenly the second voice would emerge, deeper, more resonant, articulating words with an authority that seemed to emanate from some ancient well of knowledge. This voice spoke of Birmingham's buried histories, of children who had vanished from workhouse records, of medical procedures conducted in cellars beneath respectable establishments. The neighbours began to whisper, as neighbours do when confronted with phenomena that challenge their understanding of natural order. Mrs. Whitmore's initial reports spread through the terraced streets of Edgbaston like smoke from the nearby foundries, carrying with them the acrid taste of fear and fascination. The local physician, Dr. Hartwell, was summoned on 3 separate occasions, each time departing with increasingly troubled expressions and an unwillingness to commit his observations to paper. The infant appeared perfectly healthy in all physical respects, his lungs clear, his throat unmarked by any visible abnormality, his development proceeding along expected lines. Yet the voices persisted, speaking in tandem or in sequence, creating harmonies that should not have been possible from a single larynx. By October, the matter had reached the attention of certain medical circles, whose interests extended beyond conventional practice. Dr. Percival Thorn, whose reputation for discretion in delicate matters had earned him the confidence of the Crown's most sensitive medical advisers, received correspondence that would bring him northward from his London practice. The letter, bearing seals that commanded immediate attention, spoke of a case requiring both his expertise and his absolute silence. The infant Henry Mallory had become a matter of national interest, though the nature of that interest remained carefully unspecified. Dr. Thorn's journey to Birmingham would mark the beginning of procedures that would test the boundaries between medical necessity and moral transgression. The atmosphere in the Mallory household grew increasingly oppressive as word of the impending medical examination spread through the community. Elizabeth found herself the subject of scrutiny from neighbours who had previously offered sympathy for her widowed state. The voices emanating from her child had transformed her from an object of pity into something more troubling, a keeper of secrets that challenged the natural order. She began to notice how conversations ceased when she approached, how eyes averted when she passed in the street, how even the parish visitors' calls became less frequent and more perfunctory. The weight of isolation pressed upon her shoulders like the industrial smoke that perpetually shrouded Birmingham's skyline. The child himself seemed unaware of the disturbance his condition created, continuing to play and feed and sleep with the innocent contentment of infancy. Yet observers noted that during moments when both voices spoke simultaneously, Henry's eyes would assume a peculiar intensity, as though he were listening to conversations occurring in distant rooms. Whitmore, whose vigil at her parlor window had become a neighborhood fixture, reported that during these episodes, shadows in the Mallory courtyard appeared to move independently of their sources, and the very air seemed to thicken with unspoken words. The approaching arrival of Dr. Thorn carried with it the promise of explanation, though whether that explanation would bring comfort or deeper unease remained to be seen. Dr. Percival Thorn arrived in Birmingham on the morning train, his black leather medical bag containing instruments that gleamed with an unsettling precision. His appearance in Edgbaston caused considerable stir among the residents, who recognized in his bearing the unmistakable authority of London medical circles. Tall and angular, with silver hair that caught the weak autumn light, Dr. Thorn possessed the kind of presence that commanded immediate deference. His examination of the Mallory household began not with the child, but with a thorough interrogation of Elizabeth, whose responses he recorded in a leather-bound journal using a fountain pen that scratched against the paper with mechanical regularity. The questions he posed revealed a knowledge of the case that suggested preparation far beyond what the initial correspondence might have provided. The examination of Henry himself proved both fascinating and deeply troubling to witness. Dr. Thorn's instruments, some familiar, others bearing designs that seemed to belong to no recognized medical tradition, were arranged upon Elizabeth's kitchen table with ceremonial precision. The child, initially cooperative, began to exhibit signs of distress as the examination progressed. The dual voices, which had been speaking in their usual alternating pattern, suddenly began to harmonize in a manner that filled the small room with resonances that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Dr. Thorn's expression, initially one of clinical detachment, gradually transformed into something approaching fascination, though whether scientific or more personal in nature remained unclear to the observers present. Mrs. Whitmore, who had positioned herself strategically at her window, later reported that during the most intensive portions of the examination, the gaslight in the Mallory parlor began to flicker in patterns that seemed to correspond with the child's vocalizations. The deeper voice, which had previously spoken of historical matters and buried secrets, began to address Dr. Thorn directly, using his name and referencing details of his London practice that no infant could possibly have known. The physician's responses, though conducted in whispers too low for external observation, appeared to constitute a genuine dialogue rather than the one-sided examination that medical protocol would suggest. Elizabeth Mallory, relegated to a corner of her own parlor, watched with growing alarm as her child engaged in conversations that defied every principle of natural development. The examination extended well into the evening hours, far beyond what any conventional medical assessment would require. Dr. Thorn's note-taking became increasingly frantic as the session progressed, his pen moving across the pages with an urgency that suggested discoveries of profound significance. The child's voices, rather than tiring as the day wore on, seemed to gain strength and clarity, speaking now in languages that Elizabeth could not identify, but which Dr. Thorn appeared to understand perfectly. Neighbors reported that the very air around the Mallory house seemed to thicken, carrying sounds that had no visible source and casting shadows that moved independently of any light source. The boundary between medical examination and something far more esoteric had been crossed, though none present possessed the vocabulary to articulate precisely what was occurring. As darkness fell over Edgbaston, Dr. Thorn's examination took on an increasingly ritualistic quality. The instruments he employed seemed designed not merely to observe, but to interact with whatever force was manifesting through the child's dual voices. Elizabeth, whose maternal instincts had been gradually overwhelmed by the authority of medical expertise, began to recognize that her son was no longer merely a patient, but had become the subject of an investigation whose scope extended far beyond conventional medicine. The voices speaking through Henry had begun to reveal details of Birmingham's hidden histories, of children who had disappeared from workhouse records, of medical experiments conducted in the cellars of respectable establishments, of connections between the Crown's medical advisors and practices that challenged every principle of ethical treatment. The session concluded only when Dr. Thorn declared that sufficient data had been gathered for his initial assessment. His departure from the Mallory household was marked by the presentation of documents that Elizabeth was required to sign, papers that bound her to absolute silence regarding the examination and its findings. The compensation offered was substantial enough to ensure her cooperation, though the true price of her compliance would only become apparent in the weeks that followed. As doctor, Thorn's carriage disappeared into the Birmingham night. The child Henry fell into a sleep so profound that his mother feared he might never wake. The voices, for the first time since their manifestation, had fallen completely silent. The letters that passed between Dr. Thorn and his superiors in London bore seals that commanded attention from the highest levels of government. These communications, discovered decades later in archives that were never meant to be opened, revealed the true scope of interest in the Mallory case. The infant Henry had become the subject of correspondence between the Royal College of Physicians, the Home Office, and certain unnamed advisors, whose influence extended into the most sensitive areas of Crown policy. The dual voices, rather than being dismissed as medical curiosity, had been recognized as a phenomenon with implications that reached far beyond the boundaries of conventional medicine. Dr. Thorn's reports, written in the precise language of scientific observation, described capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about human consciousness and the nature of knowledge itself. The response from London arrived within days of Dr. Thorn's initial examination, carried by a messenger whose credentials bore the unmistakable authority of government service. The instructions contained within were both specific and chilling in their implications. Henry Mallory was to be transferred to a private facility where more comprehensive studies could be conducted, away from the prying eyes of Birmingham's gossip-prone community. Elizabeth's consent was presented not as a request, but as a foregone conclusion, supported by legal documents that made clear the consequences of non-compliance. The compensation offered was substantial, but the true message was unmistakable. Cooperation was not optional when matters of Crown interest were involved. Elizabeth's resistance, though initially fierce, crumbled under the weight of official pressure and the gradual realization that forces far beyond her understanding had taken an interest in her child. The voices emanating from Henry had begun to speak of matters that touched upon state secrets, of medical experiments conducted during the Crimean conflict, of children used as subjects in studies that were never officially acknowledged, of connections between certain members of the medical establishment and practices that violated every principle of ethical treatment. Dr. Thorn's subsequent visits became increasingly frequent, each session revealing new aspects of the phenomenon that made clear why the Crown's attention had been attracted. The child was not merely speaking with two voices, but appeared to be channeling knowledge from sources that should have been inaccessible to any living person. The facility to which Henry was to be transferred existed in the grey area between medical institution and government research establishment. Located in the countryside outside London, it operated under the auspices of the Royal College, but answered to authorities whose names appeared on no public records. Dr. Thorn's role in this transfer was that of both physician and custodian, responsible for ensuring that the child's unique capabilities could be studied without attracting unwanted attention. The correspondence reveals a systematic approach to the investigation, with protocols designed to maximize the extraction of information while minimizing the risk of public exposure. The voices speaking through Henry had become a resource to be exploited rather than a medical condition to be treated. Elizabeth's final meeting with the Crown's representatives took place in the parlour, where her son's voices had first manifested their disturbing capabilities. The document she was required to sign went far beyond simple consent forms, constituting a comprehensive surrender of parental rights and an agreement to maintain absolute silence about the case for the remainder of her life. The financial compensation was presented as generous, though the true price was the permanent separation from her child and the knowledge that Henry would become the subject of studies whose nature she was forbidden to question. The representatives spoke in the measured tones of bureaucratic authority, making clear that refusal would result in consequences that extended far beyond financial hardship. The transfer itself was conducted with the efficiency of a military operation designed to minimize both public attention and emotional trauma. Henry was removed from the Mallory household during the pre-dawn hours, when the streets of Edgbaston lay shrouded in industrial fog and the neighbours remained safely behind their curtained windows. Elizabeth was permitted a final moment with her child, during which both voices spoke simultaneously, one offering the innocent farewell of an infant, the other delivering warnings about the fate that awaited him in the Crown's custody. As the carriage disappeared into the Birmingham morning, carrying her son toward a future she was forbidden to imagine, Elizabeth Mallory understood that she had become complicit in a transaction that violated every principle of maternal protection in service of interests that remained deliberately obscure. The weeks following Henry's removal from Edgbaston were marked by a silence that seemed to press against the very walls of the community. Elizabeth Mallory, now bound by agreements that made her a prisoner of her own compliance, found herself the subject of a different kind of scrutiny from her neighbours. The substantial compensation she had received was evident in small improvements to her household. New curtains, better coal, food that spoke of financial security. Yet these material gains only served to highlight the absence of the child whose voices had once filled the courtyard with their disturbing harmonies. Mrs. Whitmore, whose vigil at the parlour window had become a neighbourhood institution, reported that Elizabeth could often be seen standing in the exact spot where Henry's perambulator had rested, her lips moving in conversations with empty air. Dr. Thorn's continued presence in Birmingham served as a constant reminder that the case remained active despite the child's removal. His visits to the Mallory household became less frequent but more intensive, focusing now on Elizabeth's recollections of the voices and their content. The physician's questions revealed an ongoing interest in the specific information that had been communicated through Henry's dual vocalizations, particularly those references to historical events and buried secrets that no infant could have possessed through conventional means. Elizabeth's responses, carefully recorded in Dr. Thorn's leather-bound journal, constituted a form of testimony that would later disappear into archives that were never meant to be accessed by unauthorized personnel. The community's response to the Mallory case evolved from curiosity to a more complex mixture of fear and complicity. Neighbours who had initially been eager to discuss the strange voices now found themselves reluctant to acknowledge that the events had occurred at all. Mrs. Whitmore's detailed observations, once the subject of fascinated gossip, were now met with uncomfortable silence and suggestions that perhaps her imagination had been influenced by the industrial fumes that perpetually shrouded Birmingham's atmosphere. The collective amnesia that settled over Edgbaston was not entirely natural, supported as it was by visits from officials whose credentials suggested that continued discussion of the case would be inadvisable. Elizabeth herself began to exhibit signs of the psychological strain that accompanies forced complicity in morally ambiguous enterprises. Her diary entries, which had initially provided detailed accounts of Henry's condition, became increasingly fragmented and cryptic. She wrote of dreams in which both voices continued to speak to her, offering information about the facility where her son was being held and the nature of the studies being conducted upon him. These nocturnal communications suggested that whatever force had manifested through Henry's dual voices maintained some connection to his mother. Though whether this represented genuine supernatural contact or the product of a mind struggling with guilt and loss remained unclear even to Elizabeth herself. The official narrative that emerged to explain Henry's disappearance was crafted with the precision of professional deception. The child had been transferred to a specialist facility for treatment of a rare medical condition, with the family's full consent and cooperation. Dr. Thorn's role was presented as that of a consulting physician whose expertise had been sought to ensure the best possible care for the infant. The substantial compensation received by Elizabeth was characterized as assistance provided by charitable medical institutions to families facing extraordinary circumstances. This version of events, while internally consistent, required the active participation of everyone who had witnessed the true nature of Henry's condition, a participation that was secured through a combination of financial incentives and carefully implied consequences for non-compliance. The lasting impact of the Mallory case extended far beyond the immediate participants, establishing precedents for how similar phenomena would be handled in the future. Dr. Thorn's reports, filed in archives that existed in the grey area between medical research and state security, provided templates for the identification and management of cases that challenged conventional understanding of human capabilities. The protocols developed during Henry's examination would be refined and applied to other children whose abilities attracted the attention of authorities whose interests extended beyond conventional medicine. Elizabeth Mallory's compliance, purchased through a combination of compensation and coercion, demonstrated the effectiveness of methods that would be employed repeatedly in subsequent cases where the Crown's interests required the suppression of inconvenient truths. The autumn of 1888 brought with it a peculiar stillness to the Mallory household, as though the very walls had learned to hold their breath. Dr. Thorn's visits had ceased entirely by October, yet his influence lingered like smoke from a snuffed candle, acrid and persistent. Elizabeth found herself watching Henry with the intensity of a woman who had glimpsed something beyond the veil of ordinary understanding, her maternal instincts now sharpened to a blade's edge. The child's development proceeded with unsettling normalcy. He crawled, he babbled, he reached for toys with the innocent determination of any infant. Yet there were moments, fleeting as shadows cast by passing clouds, when his small mouth would open and two distinct sounds would emerge simultaneously, one layered beneath the other like harmonies in a discordant hymn. The servants, those few who remained after the exodus of late summer, spoke in whispers of voices that seemed to echo from empty rooms, of lullabies that continued long after Elizabeth had left the nursery. Mrs. Hartwell, the cook who had served the family for 7 years, confided to her sister in Aston that she had taken to crossing herself whenever she passed the child's door, though she could not say precisely why. The medical establishment of Birmingham had closed ranks with the efficiency of a military formation, their silence as impenetrable as the soot-stained walls of the city's foundries. Dr. Pemberton, who had once called upon the Mallorys monthly for routine consultations, now claimed a sudden abundance of patients requiring his attention elsewhere. The Royal College of Physicians, when approached by Elizabeth's desperate letters, responded with form replies that spoke of confidentiality and the sacred trust between physician and patient, though they offered no explanation for why that trust should extend to silencing the patient's own mother. In the gentlemen's clubs of the city centre, where medical men gathered over brandy and cigars, Henry Mallory's name was never spoken, yet his presence haunted every conversation like a ghost at the feast. The very absence of discussion became its own form of testimony, a negative space that outlined the shape of something too dangerous to acknowledge. Dr. Whitmore, who had assisted at the birth, was observed by his colleagues to have developed a nervous habit of touching his throat when children were mentioned, as though checking that his own voice remained singular and his own. The Crown's interest in the matter manifested not through grand proclamations or official inquiries, but through the subtle machinery of bureaucratic erasure that had served the monarchy for centuries. Birth records were amended with the quiet efficiency of clerks who understood that certain truths were incompatible with the stability of the realm. The original documentation of Henry's birth, with its careful notations of the unusual vocal phenomena, disappeared from the Birmingham Registry Office sometime in November, replaced by a standard certificate that bore no trace of medical anomaly. Palace physicians, those discreet guardians of royal health who moved through the shadows of Buckingham Palace like grey-robed monks, were said to have taken a sudden interest in the theoretical study of vocal development in infants, though their research remained classified under the Official Secrets Act. Lord Chamberlain's office issued no statements, made no acknowledgements, yet the very silence spoke volumes to those who understood the language of institutional power. The message was clear. Henry Mallory's condition was not merely a medical curiosity, but a matter of state security, a secret that threatened the very foundations upon which the monarchy's divine authority rested. Elizabeth's isolation deepened with each passing week, her social circle contracting like a wound exposed to salt air. The ladies of Edgbaston society, who had once called upon her for afternoon tea and gentle gossip, now found themselves inexplicably busy with charitable works and family obligations that prevented their visits. Mrs. Ashworth, her closest friend since childhood, confessed in a hurried conversation outside St. Bartholomew's Church that her husband had forbidden any further association with the Mallory family, though he would not explain his reasons beyond muttering about matters best left undisturbed. The local clergy, those shepherds of moral guidance who might have offered comfort in such trying times, seemed to have developed a collective amnesia regarding the Mallory pew, their sermons carefully avoiding any mention of divine mysteries or miraculous births. Even the tradesmen who had once competed for the family's custom now delivered their goods with downcast eyes and hurried departures, as though proximity to the house itself might contaminate them with whatever curse had befallen its inhabitants. The weight of this enforced solitude pressed upon Elizabeth like the heavy air before a thunderstorm, pregnant with unspoken threats and unnamed fears. The child himself remained blissfully unaware of the storm that raged around his small existence, his days filled with the simple pleasures of infancy, wooden toys, warm milk, and the comfort of his mother's arms. Yet even in his innocence, Henry seemed to sense the tension that permeated the household, his sleep becoming fitful and his feeding irregular. The dual voices that had so fascinated Dr. Thorn continued to manifest, though with less frequency than in the early months, as though whatever force had granted him this terrible gift was gradually withdrawing its influence. Elizabeth found herself both hoping for and dreading these episodes, torn between her desire to understand her son's condition and her growing fear of what that understanding might cost them both. On quiet evenings, when the industrial din of Birmingham had faded to a distant murmur, she would sit beside his crib and listen to the soft sounds of his breathing, searching for any sign of the duality that had marked his birth. Sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, she thought she heard whispers in the nursery walls, conversations in languages she did not recognize, as though the house itself had become a repository for voices that had no other place to dwell. The approach of winter brought with it a sense of impending resolution, though whether that resolution would bring salvation or damnation remained unclear. Dr. Thorn's final report, delivered to his superiors in London through channels that bypassed all conventional medical protocols, spoke of a condition that was stabilizing within acceptable parameters, though what those parameters might be was left deliberately vague. The palace's interest in the case had not waned, but had instead evolved into something more subtle and more permanent, a watching brief that would extend far beyond the child's infancy into whatever future awaited him. Elizabeth sensed this invisible surveillance like a weight upon her shoulders, the knowledge that her son would never be truly free from the Crown's attention, that his life would unfold under the constant scrutiny of those who saw him not as a child, but as a potential threat to the natural order. The autumn leaves that had once seemed beautiful in their decay now appeared to her as harbingers of a winter that might never end, a season of silence and secrecy that would define the remainder of their days. In the growing darkness of November evenings, as she drew the curtains against the watching world, Elizabeth Mallory began to understand that some secrets were too dangerous to bear alone, yet too terrible to share with anyone who might still be saved from their burden. The winter of 1888 descended upon Birmingham with the weight of a shroud, its grey skies pressing down upon the city's industrial landscape like a lid upon a coffin. Within the Mallory household, the season brought not the customary preparations for Christmas festivities, but a deepening sense of isolation that seemed to seep through the very mortar of the walls. Henry's first birthday passed without celebration, marked only by Elizabeth's private tears and the delivery of an unmarked package containing a silver rattle that bore no maker's mark or accompanying card. The gift's provenance remained a mystery, though its craftsmanship spoke of royal workshops, and its weight suggested precious metals that few could afford. When shaken, the rattle produced not the cheerful jingle expected of such toys, but a complex harmony of tones that seemed to resonate with something deep within the child's chest, causing him to fall silent and listen with an intensity that chilled his mother's blood. The servants, those few who remained in the household's employ, crossed themselves when they heard its music, though none could articulate precisely why the sound filled them with such unease. Mrs. Hartwell, the cook whose loyalty had weathered many storms, confided to Elizabeth that she had taken to hiding the rattle when her duties required her to enter the nursery, unable to bear the way its melodies seemed to call forth responses from empty corners of the room. The medical establishment's conspiracy of silence had by now achieved the status of institutional doctrine, its tendrils reaching into every corner of Birmingham's professional community. Dr. Pemberton, who had once been a frequent visitor to the Mallory home, was observed by his colleagues to have developed a pronounced stutter when discussing cases involving children, his words catching in his throat as though some invisible hand sought to prevent their utterance. The Birmingham Medical Society's monthly meetings, once lively forums for the discussion of unusual cases and medical curiosities, had become exercises in careful omission, their proceedings edited with the precision of state censors to remove any reference to vocal anomalies or dual speech patterns. Young medical students at the university found their questions about such phenomena met with sharp rebukes from professors who had once encouraged intellectual curiosity, the academic atmosphere growing thick with unspoken prohibitions. Dr. Whitmore, whose assistance at Henry's birth had made him an unwilling witness to the child's condition, was granted a sudden and unexpected fellowship at Edinburgh University. His departure from Birmingham so hasty that he left behind personal effects and unpaid debts. Those who knew him well remarked upon the haunted quality that had settled over his features in recent months, the way his eyes would dart to shadows and his hand would unconsciously rise to his throat during conversations about his former practice. The Crown's involvement in the matter had evolved from active intervention to passive surveillance, a watching brief that required no official acknowledgement yet commanded absolute compliance from all who might encounter its influence. Palace physicians, those discreet guardians of royal health whose very existence was known only to a select few, had established what they termed a monitoring protocol for cases of unusual vocal development throughout the realm. Birth registrars in major cities received new guidelines for reporting anomalous medical conditions, their instructions couched in language so bureaucratic as to obscure their true purpose while ensuring complete compliance. The Royal College of Physicians found its research funding mysteriously increased for studies into hereditary vocal disorders, though the results of such research were classified immediately upon completion and filed in archives that few would ever access. Lord Chamberlain's office maintained its official silence on all matters relating to the Mallory case, yet its influence could be felt in the sudden career advancements of those who had demonstrated appropriate discretion and the equally sudden reversals of fortune that befell anyone who showed signs of indiscretion. The machinery of state secrecy, honed through centuries of practice in concealing inconvenient truths, had embraced Henry Mallory's existence as both a challenge and an opportunity to demonstrate its continued relevance in an age of increasing public scrutiny. Elizabeth's world had contracted to the dimensions of her own home, its walls becoming both sanctuary and prison as the outside world retreated beyond her reach. The social isolation that had begun as whispered conversations and cancelled invitations had crystallized into something more permanent and more devastating, a complete severing of the connections that had once anchored her to the community of Edgbaston. Her correspondence, once filled with invitations and social obligations, had dwindled to official communications from tradesmen and the occasional letter from distant relatives who remained ignorant of her circumstances. The local church, St. Bartholomew's, where she had worshipped since childhood, seemed to have developed a collective blindness to her presence, the congregation's eyes sliding past her pew as though it had become invisible to their sight. Reverend Morrison, who had baptized Henry in those hopeful early days before the truth of his condition became apparent, now delivered sermons that seemed carefully crafted to avoid any mention of divine mysteries or miraculous births, his voice taking on a strained quality whenever his gaze fell upon the empty Mallory pew. The weight of this enforced solitude pressed upon Elizabeth's spirit like a physical burden, each day bringing fresh evidence of how thoroughly she and her son had been erased from the social fabric of their community. In the long winter evenings, as she sat beside Henry's crib and listened to the wind howling through the eaves, she began to understand that their isolation was not merely a consequence of their circumstances, but a deliberate construction, as carefully engineered as any of Birmingham's industrial marvels. The child's development continued along paths that defied conventional understanding, his growth marked by milestones that brought both wonder and terror to his mother's heart. Henry's attempts at speech, when they came, carried within them the same duality that had marked his earliest cries, words emerging in harmonies that seemed to originate from two distinct sources within his small frame. Mama became a chord, rather than a simple utterance, the familiar syllables layered with undertones that spoke of depths beyond his infant comprehension. Elizabeth found herself responding to these dual calls with a confusion that bordered on madness, uncertain which voice represented her true son and which might be something else entirely, some presence that had taken residence within his innocent form. The servants who remained in the household's employ learned to avoid the nursery during these episodes, their superstitious natures unable to reconcile the child's angelic appearance with the unsettling complexity of his vocalizations. Mrs. Hartwell, whose practical Yorkshire nature had weathered many storms, confessed to Elizabeth that she had begun leaving small offerings of bread and milk outside the nursery door, following half-remembered rituals from her grandmother's time that were meant to appease restless spirits. The cook's admission, delivered in whispers over the kitchen fire, revealed the depth to which fear had penetrated even the most rational members of the household, transforming a home that had once been filled with laughter into a place where ancient superstitions held sway over modern sensibilities. The approach of spring brought no relief from the winter of secrecy that had settled over the Mallory household, the changing seasons serving only to highlight the unchanging nature of their isolation. Dr. Thorn's influence, though no longer manifested through personal visits, continued to shape their circumstances through the network of professional obligations and royal prerogatives that he had set in motion. Elizabeth received occasional communications from medical authorities, carefully worded documents that spoke of ongoing monitoring and periodic assessments, without ever explicitly acknowledging the nature of Henry's condition or the reasons for such scrutiny. These letters, delivered by messengers who would not meet her eyes and departed without waiting for replies, served as reminders that her son's existence remained a matter of state interest, his future subject to decisions made in rooms she would never enter by men she would never meet. The weight of this knowledge settled upon her shoulders like a mantle of lead, the understanding that Henry would never be free to live an ordinary life, that his every word and gesture would be subject to evaluation by those who saw him not as a child, but as a phenomenon to be contained. In the growing light of longer days, as Birmingham's industrial machinery resumed its relentless rhythm after winter's brief respite, Elizabeth Mallory began to comprehend the true scope of the prison that had been constructed around her family. Its bars forged not from iron but from silence, its locks secured not with keys but with the weight of secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. The spring of 1889 brought to Birmingham a renewal that seemed to mock the stagnation that had settled over the Mallory household like a blight upon the soul. As the city's foundries roared back to life after winter's brief respite, and the Reyes waters ran clearer with the melting of accumulated ice, Elizabeth found herself increasingly aware of the contrast between the world's natural rhythms and the artificial suspension in which her family existed. Henry, now approaching his second birthday, had begun to walk with the unsteady determination common to all toddlers, yet his movements carried within them a peculiar grace that suggested an awareness beyond his years. His dual voices had not diminished with age, but had instead evolved, developing distinct tonal qualities that made it impossible to dismiss them as mere medical curiosity or acoustic illusion. The higher voice retained the innocent clarity expected of a child his age, while the lower carried undertones that seemed to resonate from depths that should not exist within so small a frame. Elizabeth found herself listening to these vocal manifestations with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts, searching for patterns or meanings that might explain the inexplicable burden that had been placed upon her son. The servants, those few who remained loyal despite the household's increasingly oppressive atmosphere, had developed their own theories about the child's condition, whispered explanations that drew upon folklore and superstition rather than medical science, their rational minds unable to process what their ears clearly perceived. Dr. Thorn's absence from their daily lives had not diminished his influence over their circumstances, his initial intervention having set in motion a machinery of surveillance and control that operated with the inexorable precision of clockwork. The Royal College of Physicians had established what they termed a longitudinal study of Henry's development, a clinical euphemism that masked the reality of constant observation and periodic assessment by medical professionals who appeared without warning and departed without explanation. These visits, conducted by men whose credentials were impeccable but whose manner suggested military rather than medical training, involved examinations that were thorough to the point of violation. Their procedures designed to document every aspect of the child's vocal development, while revealing nothing of their ultimate purpose. Elizabeth was required to maintain detailed records of Henry's speech patterns, his sleeping habits, his responses to various stimuli. These observations compiled into reports that disappeared into the same bureaucratic void that had swallowed all other evidence of her son's condition. The weight of this enforced collaboration in her own child's objectification pressed upon her conscience like a stone, yet she understood that resistance would bring consequences too terrible to contemplate, that her cooperation was the price of Henry's continued existence within the family home, rather than some institutional facility where his condition might be studied without the inconvenience of maternal interference. The community of Edgbaston had by now achieved a collective amnesia regarding the Mallory family that was so complete as to suggest orchestration rather than natural social evolution. Neighbors who had once exchanged pleasantries over garden fences now averted their eyes when Elizabeth appeared, their behavior suggesting not mere embarrassment, but active fear of contamination by association. The local tradesmen who had once competed for the family's custom now fulfilled their obligations with mechanical efficiency, delivering goods without conversation and departing with unseemly haste, their manner suggesting that they viewed the Mallory household as a place of contagion rather than commerce. St. Bartholomew's Church, where Elizabeth had once found solace in weekly worship, had become a place of exile rather than sanctuary, the congregation's collective blindness to her presence so pronounced that she began to question whether she had become invisible to their sight or merely irrelevant to their concerns. Reverend Morrison's sermons, once filled with references to divine mysteries and miraculous interventions, had evolved into careful dissertations on conventional morality and social obligation, his voice taking on a strained quality whenever his gaze fell upon the empty space where the Mallory pew had once been occupied. The transformation of her social world from welcoming community to hostile wilderness had been so gradual and so complete that Elizabeth sometimes wondered whether she had imagined the warmth and acceptance that had once surrounded her family, whether the isolation that now defined their existence was not the natural state of things, but rather a carefully constructed illusion designed to contain whatever threat Henry's condition was perceived to represent. The child himself remained largely oblivious to the storm that raged around his small existence, his days filled with the simple pleasures of discovery and growth that marked all healthy development. Yet there were moments, fleeting as shadows cast by passing clouds, when Henry seemed to sense the weight of attention that surrounded him, his innocent eyes taking on a quality of awareness that was both touching and terrifying to behold. His play had begun to incorporate elements that suggested an understanding of his own duality, conversations with invisible companions that were conducted in both of his voices, as though he were learning to mediate between two distinct aspects of his own nature. Elizabeth watched these episodes with a mixture of fascination and horror, uncertain whether she was witnessing the natural adaptation of a child to his unusual circumstances or the emergence of something more profound and more dangerous. The toys that had been provided for his amusement, blocks and balls and simple wooden animals, seemed to respond to his presence in ways that defied rational explanation, their positions shifting when no one was watching, their surfaces bearing marks that suggested handling by hands other than his own. Mrs. Hartwell, whose practical nature had been the household's anchor through many storms, confessed to Elizabeth that she had taken to blessing the nursery with holy water each morning, following rituals half-remembered from her Catholic grandmother's teachings, though she could not say whether these ministrations brought comfort or merely highlighted the inadequacy of conventional spiritual remedies in the face of whatever force had taken residence within the child. The medical establishment's conspiracy of silence had by now achieved the status of professional doctrine, its influence extending far beyond Birmingham's boundaries to encompass the entire network of British medical practice. Young physicians beginning their careers found themselves subject to informal but unmistakable guidance regarding the discussion of vocal anomalies in children, their mentors steering them away from such topics with the subtle pressure that marked all effective censorship. Medical journals that had once published case studies of unusual conditions now rejected submissions dealing with dual speech patterns or harmonic vocalizations, their editorial policies shaped by considerations that were never explicitly acknowledged but were universally understood. The Royal College of Physicians had established new protocols for the reporting of unusual births, procedures that ensured such cases would be channeled through appropriate authorities rather than becoming subjects of public discussion or academic debate. Dr. Whitmore's sudden departure for Edinburgh had been followed by similar relocations of other medical professionals who had demonstrated excessive curiosity about Henry's condition. their careers redirected with the efficiency of a military operation designed to minimize potential security breaches. The message was clear to all who possessed the wisdom to read between the lines. Certain knowledge was too dangerous for general circulation. Certain truths too threatening to the established order to be permitted free expression within the medical community. The approach of Henry's second birthday brought with it a sense of impending crisis that seemed to permeate the very atmosphere of the household, as though the anniversary of his birth might somehow trigger a resolution of the tensions that had been building since that fateful November morning. Elizabeth found herself dreading the date with an intensity that surprised her, uncertain whether her fears were grounded in rational concern or merely the product of months of enforced isolation and constant surveillance. The unmarked gifts that had appeared on previous occasions, the silver rattle, the wooden toys that seemed to move of their own accord, the books written in languages she could not identify, had established a pattern of anonymous attention that suggested Henry's birthday would not pass unnoticed by those who monitored his development. Dr. Thorn's influence, though no longer manifested through personal visits, continued to shape their circumstances through the network of professional obligations and royal prerogatives that he had established, his initial assessment having condemned them to a lifetime of scrutiny and control. In the lengthening days of late spring, as Birmingham's industrial machinery resumed its relentless rhythm and the city's population emerged from winter's hibernation, Elizabeth Mallory began to understand that her son's second birthday would mark not a celebration of his growth but a reckoning with forces that had been gathering strength since the moment of his first dual cry, a confrontation with powers that viewed his existence not as a blessing but as a challenge to the natural order that must be contained at any cost. The second anniversary of Henry Mallory's birth arrived with the inexorable certainty of a funeral procession, its approach marked not by celebration but by a deepening sense of foreboding that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the Edgbaston house. Elizabeth had ceased to mark the passage of days with any hope of change or resolution, her existence having settled into the rhythm of a woman serving a life sentence for crimes she could not name. The child who had brought such joy to her heart now represented a burden that threatened to crush her spirit beneath its weight, not through any fault of his own, but through the terrible knowledge that his every breath was monitored, his every sound catalogued, his every gesture evaluated by men who saw him not as her son, but as a phenomenon to be contained. Henry's development had continued along its impossible trajectory, his dual voices growing stronger and more distinct with each passing month, their harmonies achieving a complexity that defied all conventional understanding of human vocal anatomy. The higher voice retained the sweet clarity of childhood innocence, while the lower had deepened into tones that seemed to originate from caverns beneath the earth, their resonance suggesting depths that should not exist within any mortal frame. Elizabeth found herself listening to these manifestations with the desperate attention of a woman seeking signs of salvation in the very thing that had damned her family, searching for some indication that her son's condition might be evolving towards something more manageable, more human, more compatible with the world into which he had been born. The machinery of state surveillance that had been established around Henry's existence had achieved a level of sophistication that would have impressed the most paranoid of monarchs. Its operations conducted with such discretion that even those who participated in its activities remained largely ignorant of its true scope. Medical professionals throughout the realm found themselves subject to new protocols and reporting requirements that seemed designed to identify and isolate any cases bearing resemblance to Henry's condition, their compliance ensured through a combination of professional advancement for the cooperative and career destruction for the recalcitrant. The Royal College of Physicians had established what they termed a special research division dedicated to the study of vocal anomalies, its findings classified at the highest levels of government, and its personnel bound by oaths that carried penalties more severe than those imposed upon military officers handling state secrets. Dr. Thorn's initial report had spawned an entire bureaucracy dedicated to the management of what palace physicians had begun to refer to as the Mallory Protocol, a comprehensive system for identifying, monitoring, and, when necessary, eliminating threats to the established order that might arise from similar manifestations of unnatural vocal phenomena. The Crown's interest in the matter had not diminished, but had instead evolved into something more permanent and more pervasive. a watching brief that would extend far beyond Henry's childhood into whatever future awaited him, should he be permitted to reach adulthood under circumstances that remained entirely at the discretion of those who held ultimate authority over his fate. The isolation that had been imposed upon the Mallory family had achieved such completeness that Elizabeth sometimes wondered whether they had been erased not merely from society, but from reality itself, their existence reduced to a shadow play performed for an audience of one. The servants who had once filled the house with life and laughter had been replaced by a skeleton staff, whose loyalty was ensured through means that Elizabeth preferred not to contemplate, their silence purchased with gold, and their discretion guaranteed through threats that were never explicitly stated, but were universally understood. Mrs. Hartwell, the cook whose Yorkshire practicality had been the household's anchor through many storms, had been pensioned off with suspicious generosity, her replacement a dour woman whose eyes held the flat quality of those who had seen too much and spoken too little. The tradesmen who supplied the household's needs now conducted their business through intermediaries, their goods delivered by men who would not meet Elizabeth's eyes and departed without waiting for acknowledgement of their service. Even the postal service seemed to have developed a selective blindness regarding the Mallory address, letters arriving with increasing rarity, and those that did reach the house bearing the unmistakable signs of having been opened and resealed by hands other than those of their intended recipients. The transformation of their home from sanctuary to prison had been so gradual and so complete that Elizabeth sometimes found herself questioning whether the warmth and acceptance that had once surrounded her family had ever existed, or whether the isolation that now defined their existence was not the natural state of things, but rather a carefully constructed illusion designed to contain whatever threat Henry's condition was perceived to represent. Henry himself had begun to display an awareness of his circumstances that was both heartening and terrifying to witness, his innocent eyes taking on a quality of understanding that seemed far beyond his tender years. His play had evolved to incorporate elements that suggested a growing comprehension of his own duality, conversations with invisible companions conducted in both of his voices, as though he were learning to mediate between two distinct aspects of his own nature. The toys that surrounded him, blocks and balls and simple wooden animals, seemed to respond to his presence in ways that defied rational explanation, their positions shifting when no one was watching, their surfaces bearing marks that suggested handling by hands other than his own. Elizabeth watched these manifestations with a mixture of wonder and horror, uncertain whether she was witnessing the natural adaptation of a child to his unusual circumstances or the emergence of something more profound and more dangerous. The books that had appeared anonymously in his nursery, written in languages that scholars at Birmingham University claimed not to recognize, seemed to hold his attention for hours at a time, his small fingers tracing symbols that meant nothing to his mother, but appeared to convey profound significance to his developing mind. Mrs. Hartwell's replacement, the dour woman whose name Elizabeth had never learned, was observed to cross herself whenever she entered the nursery, her lips moving in prayers that were conducted in whispers too low to be overheard, but whose urgency was unmistakable to any who witnessed her devotions. The medical examinations that had become a regular feature of Henry's existence had evolved from simple assessments to elaborate procedures that seemed designed more to satisfy scientific curiosity than to ensure the child's well-being. The physicians who conducted these evaluations arrived without warning and departed without explanation, their credentials impeccable, but their manner suggesting military rather than medical training. Their examinations were thorough to the point of violation, involving procedures that seemed designed to test the limits of Henry's vocal abilities rather than to monitor his health, their instruments, strange devices that Elizabeth had never seen in any conventional medical practice. The reports they compiled disappeared into the same bureaucratic void that had swallowed all other evidence of her son's condition, their findings becoming part of a growing archive that would never see the light of public scrutiny. Elizabeth was required to maintain detailed records of Henry's development, observations that were collected by anonymous functionaries who appeared at regular intervals to ensure her compliance with protocols that were never fully explained, but whose importance was emphasized through implications rather than explicit threats. The weight of this enforced collaboration in her own child's objectification pressed upon her conscience like a stone, yet she understood that resistance would bring consequences too terrible to contemplate, that her cooperation was the price of Henry's continued existence within the family home, rather than some institutional facility where his condition might be studied without the inconvenience of maternal interference. The approach of winter brought with it a sense of finality that seemed to permeate the very atmosphere of the household, as though the changing seasons were marking not merely the passage of time, but the approach of some ultimate reckoning. Dr. Thorn's influence, though no longer manifested through personal visits, continued to shape their circumstances through the network of professional obligations and royal prerogatives that he had established, his initial assessment having condemned them to a lifetime of scrutiny and control. The unmarked communications that arrived with increasing frequency spoke of evolving protocols and enhanced monitoring procedures, their language suggesting that Henry's condition was being viewed not as a stable anomaly, but as a developing threat that required increasingly sophisticated containment measures. Elizabeth found herself dreading each new directive, uncertain whether the next communication might bring news of her son's removal to some facility where his condition could be studied without the complications introduced by maternal attachment. In the growing darkness of November evenings, as she drew the curtains against a world that had ceased to acknowledge their existence, Elizabeth Mallory began to understand that the silence that surrounded her family was not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of something far more sinister, a conspiracy of erasure that sought to remove all trace of Henry's existence from the historical record, leaving behind only the whispered legends that would survive in the memories of those few who had witnessed the impossible and lived to speak of it in hushed tones to their children and grandchildren, ensuring that the truth of what had transpired in that Edgbaston house would persist long after the official records had been consigned to flames and the participants in the conspiracy had been claimed by the grave that awaits all who serve powers greater than themselves.